Margie was standing in the lobby of the law offices of Henderson and Son. It had been almost a week since her husband Phil's funeral. Margie was waiting for George to finish up some last-minute paperwork before he walked into the office conference room to read Phil's will. As George entered the lobby, he handed Margie a sealed envelope and said, "Margie, Phil wanted you to have this and is to only be opened after the reading of his will and you have returned home." Margie walked into the large corner office that George Henderson called his office. She was a bit surprised to see Phil's sister and brother also in the office. The attorney walked over to his filing cabinet, inserted a key and opened one of the drawers. He removed a rather large file and returned to his desk and opened the file. As he did so, her paralegal took the 3 copies of the cover sheet and gave one each to the 3 sitting in front of George. George cleared his throat and took a drink of water and began. "As you can see, the page in front of you is the dates of the creation of this will along with changes made over the last 25 years. This was something Phil demanded I do. Also at the bottom is a list of every paralegal or clerk typist that has ever had access to this document. As of the time of Phil's death, his estate was worth $430 million. Of that amount, $100 million is liquid." George stopped speaking so the 3 people in front of him could take in the information. Margie was thinking, since Phil died, so did his prenup he was so determined I signed before he agreed to marry me was no null and voided by his death. She knew Phil was not close to his brother and sister and wondered why they were there. "As Phil's wife I get everything." George took another drink of water and began. "To my brother Sam I leave my 50% share of Davidson Aircraft and the 1,000 acres of property it sits on. I have also forgiven the $50 million debt you owed me. Sam, it took me a long time to come to terms with how you treated your family. In the end, though, I did not want to take hatred and unforgiveness to my grave." George stopped reading and called the paralegal back to get 3 more sheets of paper and give them one each. The paper listed all the assets that came with the 50% share and its value of $100 million at the time of Phil's death. Margie was starting to get angry now. A full quarter of the estate was gone, and the sister had not been told what she was getting. George begins, "To my sister Barbara I leave all my stocks, as well as $40 million in cash." Again, the paralegal took 3 papers and gave each one. George told them that those stocks were worth $110 million. As he also pointed out a listing of all the stocks. Margie was doing some math in her head and said, "Okay, that leaves $180 million and almost $60 million of that was in cash. I can live comfortably on that," Margie said. Then George took another drink of water and began to speak again. "The remainder of my estate I leave to the Sisters of Mercy Hospital so they can continue to help dash." Margie stopped listening and her world collapsed around her. The next thing she knew, 2 EMTs were standing next to her and asking her questions. "Get away from me," Margie screamed. Margie pointed at George and said, "I will contest this will. I know that Phil's business manager will be handling these matters. You tell him if he as much as gives away 1 penny, I will take him to the cleaners." George finished the reading of the will and looked at Margie. George looked at Margie and said, "All the information you need is in that envelope I gave you before we started. I think you should read that letter before you make statements about lawsuits. Also, I have one last package to give you, but you will get it in 24 hours as Phil directed. Now go home, Margie, and start planning on your move because that house you are living in belongs to Davidson Aircraft and the owners want you out in 30 days. Margie was fuming as she walked out of the building and into the parking lot only to find her BMW had been removed. As she turned around, that same paralegal told her she was to give Margie a ride home. By now Margie figured the veins on her neck were popping out, she was so mad. The first thing Margie did when she got home was to log into her bank records and saw her accounts were okay, the $150,000 was safe. So, as she walked by the fireplace, she looked at the photos on the mantel and started cursing Phil and his parents. Then she took all 3 photos and smashed them into the fireplace. She then walked into her sitting room, poured a glass of wine and opened the envelope. The letter was dated almost 6 months prior. "Margie, if you are reading this letter, it means you have just returned from the reading of my will and see I left you nothing. By now you may have reached out to Mike or are thinking about hiring him to contest my will. I would discourage you from doing so. In about 24 hours you will have a package delivered from my attorney. In that package you will find hours of videos of you having sex with Paul in my home and at the club. When I learned you were cheating on me, that was when I contacted George and had him change my will. Enclosed with this letter you will find a copy of the prenup you signed. This prenup is ironclad, and if you remember, Mike was advising you to not sign it. George has highlighted the relevant parts of the prenup. Also, let me remind you that I also know about your hidden cash. That cash belongs to my estate, and George, by the time you read this letter, will have frozen those funds. George is also filing a lawsuit against Paul. I also know about the money he has embezzled from Davidson Aircraft. By now Paul would have been notified of his removal as president of my company. All his stocks are now frozen, and he will soon lose them. Paul's wife will also be getting a package much as you will get. Margie, I had a full physical about a week before I dictated this letter. If you are reading this, it means I died unexpectedly, and if you have anything to do with it, I would run. George knows several of the best forensic pathologists in the world. Margie, in closing I leave you with the last words Khan said toward Captain Kirk in one of those Star Trek movies. No, you can't get away, from hell's heart I stab thee, for hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee. Margie thought about her last conversation with Paul the night before Phil died. Margie knew she had nothing to do with Phil's death. But could Paul have done something, Margie thought. Margie called her sister and asked her to help her get some things out of the house. About 3 hours later, as Margie was about to get into the passenger side of her sister's car, she heard the police vehicle coming up the driveway. It was unmarked, but Margie knew it was the police. When the two detectives got out of the car, they approached Margie and said, "Margie Davidson, you are under arrest for the murder of Phil Davidson." Margie protested, "I did not do anything to Phil," Margie screamed. The detective said Mrs. Davidson, Paul Farmer had just confessed to the murder and said you were part of the planning. In this state that makes you a co-conspirator. Margie started to cry as one detective cuffed her and the other one read her rights.